She hit the dirt road face first with the baby still screaming against her chest. Not a stumble. Not a trip. Her legs simply gave out 3 days without water, 2 without food, 1 dead horse rotting 5 miles back in the Kansas heat, and her body decided it was done. The baby kept crying. Clara Hayes pressed her mouth into the cracked earth and whispered the only prayer she had left. Not yet. Please. Not yet. Then a shadow fell over her, and a man's voice, rough as gravel and twice as heavy, said, "You alive, ma'am?" If this story already has your heart pounding, you're exactly where you belong. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss a single part. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The summer of 1878 turned Kansas into a furnace. By mid-July, the grass along the Dustfall Road had gone the color of old bone, and the sky pressed down flat and white like a hot iron held too close to cloth. Cicadas screamed from morning to dark. The creek beds cracked open. Even the wind, when it came, brought nothing but more heat and the smell of baked red earth. Elijah Cross had been working his fence line since sunup, which meant he'd been alone with his thoughts for 6 hours, which meant he was in a foul enough mood that his ranch hand, a 16-year-old named Pete, had found somewhere else to be before noon. That was fine by Elijah. He preferred it that way. He'd preferred it that way for 3 years now, ever since he'd come home from Wichita to find Margaret's sister sitting on his porch, with her hands folded in her lap, and an expression on her face that told him everything before she opened her mouth. His wife. His son, the boy who'd lived exactly 4 hours. Both of them gone by the time Elijah had made the 3-day ride home. After that conversation had started to feel like something that happened to other people. He was pulling wire tight along the southeast post when he heard it. Not a voice, not a cry, just a sound like something heavy dropping onto the road that ran along the outer edge of his property. He didn't move at first. Probably a coyote hit by a wagon. Probably nothing. Then he heard the baby. High, thin, desperate. The kind of cry that bypassed the ears and went straight for something older and deeper in a man's chest. Elijah set down his fencing pliers, picked up the rifle that leaned against the post beside him, habit not threat, and walked to the road. She was face down in the dirt. A woman dark-haired wearing a calico dress that had been blue once and was now the color of dust. A canvas bag had fallen open beside her. Its contents scattered a tin cup, a folded piece of paper, a baby's cloth rabbit worn to threads, and pressed against her chest, howling at the white sky with every bit of air in its lungs, was an infant. Maybe 8 months old. Face red as a beet, tiny fists clenched. Elijah crouched down. "You alive, ma'am?" A beat of silence. Then her fingers moved, pressing harder around the baby. "Not..." Her voice cracked like dry wood. "Not done yet." He watched her try to push herself up and fail. Watched her try again. Her arms shook so badly, the baby nearly rolled sideways, and she made a sound half gasp, half sob, and pulled the child back in tight. "Easy," Elijah said. "Easy now." He set the rifle in the grass, reached out carefully the way he'd reach toward a horse that had been running too hard, slow, visible, no sudden moves. "Let me take the baby." She turned her head and looked at him for the first time. Her eyes were brown, dark as creek mud, and they were sharp in a way that surprised him. Not afraid. Calculating. Sizing him up the way a woman does when she's been frightened by enough men that every new one starts out a potential threat. "Who are you?" she said. "Elijah Cross. I own this land." He kept his hand out steady. "The baby's overheating. Let me take her." A long moment. The baby screamed. The cicadas screamed louder. Then she loosened her arms. He lifted the infant carefully, tucking her against his left arm, and the baby's cries didn't stop, but they changed pitch, more surprised than desperate. He stood and turned toward the gate. "Can you walk?" he said. "I can walk." She got to her hands and knees, got one foot under her. The other foot followed, then gave out, and she caught herself on the fence post with both hands and stood there breathing like she'd run a mile. Elijah said. Come on, then. He didn't offer his arm. Somehow, he knew she wouldn't take it. She gathered what had fallen from her bag, moving with painful slowness, and followed him through the gate. He brought them to the porch out of the direct sun and poured water from the bucket into a tin cup and handed it to her. She drank it in 4 long swallows and held the cup out for more without saying a word. He poured again. She drank again. Then she sat down on the porch step, held out her arms, and he gave her the baby back. The child had quieted some. He watched the woman check the baby over, running her hands along the small arms, pressing her lips to the tiny forehead, to test for fever, pulling back the wrap to check the skin. Her hands were steady now, more steady than the rest of her. She knew what she was doing. Horse died 5 miles back, she said without looking up. 3 days ago. We've been walking. In July. His voice was flat. Across open ground. I stayed off the road mostly. Didn't want to be seen. She paused. By certain people. He pulled up the second chair from the corner of the porch, the one that hadn't been used in 3 years, and sat down. Not close. Far enough that she could breathe. Where are you headed? I don't know yet. Where are you coming from? She looked up at him then, held his gaze for a moment. Missouri. Before that, Wichita. Before that. She stopped. Doesn't matter where I'm from. Where I'm from is the problem. Elijah crossed his arms. He had a lot of questions and the patience to not ask any of them. He'd learned a long time ago that people told you what you needed to know eventually if you just stopped filling the silence. She lasted about 30 seconds. My name is Clara Hayes, she said. My husband was Thomas Hayes. He died 11 months ago. Her voice didn't waver, just delivered the facts the way a person does when they've said them enough times that the words have gone smooth and hard like stones in a riverbed. His brother Boyd decided he wanted the land we'd homesteaded. When I wouldn't sign it over, he went to Reverend Crane in Dustfall and told him I was an unfit mother. Said Thomas hadn't wanted the baby. Said the child should be placed with a proper family and the land should revert to Boyd since I had no legal standing. Elijah said nothing. I left before they could make it official, Clara said. Took Lily and whatever I could carry, and I left. She looked down at the baby Lily, who had fallen into the half-doze of a child who's cried herself to exhaustion. I know that makes me look guilty. I know that. But I also know what Reverend Crane does to women who stand up in front of his congregation and say no. I watched him do it to 2 others before me. What did he do? She met his eyes, stripped them of everything they had, legally, publicly, and smiled while he did it. The cicadas filled the silence between them. Elijah looked out at the land, his fence line, his grass burned gold, his empty barn, with the 2 horses standing in the shade inside. Then he looked back at her. You eaten today? Clara blinked, like the question didn't compute. No. Yesterday. Half a biscuit. Found some wild plums. She paused. The plums were mostly bad. He stood. Come inside. She didn't move. Mr. Cross. Elijah. Elijah. She said his name carefully like she was testing the weight of it. I'm not asking for charity. I can work. I can cook and mend, and I was a school teacher before I married, so I can read and write and keep accounts. She lifted her chin. I'll work for room and board. I won't be a burden. I know, he said. Come inside. He'd already opened the door. After a moment she followed. Hector Vance showed up 2 hours later, the way Hector always did. Unannounced, smelling of coal smoke from the forge, moving his large frame through the kitchen doorway with the ease of a man who'd been walking through that door for 15 years. He stopped when he saw Clara sitting at the table feeding Lily. His eyes went to Elijah, who was at the stove. Elijah did not turn around. Hector pulled out a chair, sat down, and said very carefully, "Well,
This story was posted on the
you want
channel The
coffee?"
Rusty Saddle.
Elijah
Please do
said.
not repost it
"I want
in
an
any form.
explanation." "Coffee first." Hector accepted the cup, looked at Clara. She met his gaze directly, which he seemed to appreciate most people didn't. "Hector Vance," he said. "Clara Hayes. You come through Dustfall." "Around it," she said, deliberately. Something shifted in Hector's expression. "You, the woman Reverend Crane's been talking about?" Clara's hands tightened slightly on Lily's wrap. "What's he been saying? That you abandoned your deceased husband's estate, that you're traveling without a guardian, that the child's welfare is—" Hector paused, chose his words. "In question." "He's lying," she said. Her voice was quiet and absolute. "Every word of that is a lie built on top of my brother-in-law's greed and Crane's need to keep women afraid of him." Hector looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned to Elijah. "She's staying." Elijah poured himself coffee. "She's staying." "Elijah." Hector's voice dropped. "Crane's already got influence in this county. Judge Whitmore owes him 3 different favors. If he finds out you're harboring—" "I'm not harboring anyone," Elijah said. "I hired a housekeeper, completely legal, completely above board." He sat down. "Write it up if you need it written up." Hector stared at him. Then he looked at Clara. Then at the baby who had fallen asleep against Clara's chest, with one small fist wrapped around Clara's braid. He exhaled slowly. "Crane's got a mean streak under all that Bible talk. He don't forget and he don't forgive. You understand that?" "I understand it better than you do," Clara said. Hector nodded, drank his coffee. "All right then." He set the cup down. "I'll keep my ears open. But you—" he pointed at Clara. "You stay off the main road. Don't go into town unless you have to. And when you do, go with Elijah." "I don't need—" "I know you don't need it," Hector said firmly. "But Crane's men will think twice before bothering a woman standing next to Elijah Cross. And thinking twice is all the time you need." He stood. "You want thinking twice, or you want to be right?" Clara looked at him. A corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, but something near it. "Thinking twice." "Good." He put his hat back on. "I'll be back tomorrow with some things from the store. Don't argue about it," he added, looking at Elijah. "It ain't charity, it's strategy." After he left, the kitchen was quiet for a moment. Lily stirred, made a small sound, and settled back to sleep. "He doesn't believe in wasting words," Clara said. "No," Elijah agreed. "I respect that. Most people find it rude. Most people talk too much." She stood carefully and looked around the kitchen. "Where do you want me to put her down? I'll start on supper after." He showed her the small room off the main hall, the one that had been a storage room for the last 3 years. Boxes stacked against the wall, a narrow cot buried under old horse blankets. He started pulling boxes out, and she pulled blankets off, and neither of them spoke, and in 20 minutes there was a clean space with a folded quilt on the cot, and room enough to lay Lily down on a pallet of folded blankets. Clara set the baby down with the careful precision of a woman who'd been doing it alone for 8 months. She tucked the cloth rabbit beside her, stood up, turned and almost walked directly into Elijah, who'd stepped in to set the last box against the wall and hadn't had room to get out. They stood 3 inches apart. He stepped back immediately. "Sorry, ma'am." "Clara," she said. He looked at her. Something flickered across his face, not quite discomfort, not quite recognition. Something older. He stepped out of the doorway and let her pass. She made supper from what she found: dried beans, salt pork, cornbread from the last of the meal in the tin. She worked quietly and efficiently, moving around the kitchen like she was measuring the space, learning it. He sat at the table and watched her, not because he was keeping track of her, but because it had been a very long time since there had been someone to watch. When she set the plate in front of him, she said without sitting down, "I want you to know something." He waited. "I didn't come here looking for this," she said. "I wasn't looking for anyone to take me in. I wasn't—" She stopped. Started again. "I've had men offer to help me. In Wichita, in 2 other towns, and there's always a cost." Her eyes were steady. "I want you to know that if that's what this is, I'd rather take my chances on the road." Elijah looked at her for a long moment. "It isn't," he said. She held his gaze another beat, nodded once, sat down and picked up her fork. They ate without speaking. Outside, the Kansas evening was settling into something almost bearable, the brutal white heat of the day pressing back to something merely hot, the cicadas starting to slow, the first breath of night air moving through the window over the sink. Clara washed the dishes. He dried them. She put them away because she'd already noted where they went. She was pulling the kitchen curtain against the evening when she saw it through the window, visible past the barn, the shape of a wooden cross marking a grave at the edge of the property. The grass around it was tall. No fresh flowers, not in this heat. But someone had kept the weeds back. She didn't say anything, but she stood at the window a second longer than she needed to, and Elijah behind her watched her see it and said nothing either. After he went to bed, footsteps heavy on the stairs, door closed. Silence. Clara sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a while. She didn't light the lamp, just sat with Lily's small breathing audible from the next room, and the night sounds outside the window, and the unfamiliar feeling of 4 walls around her that weren't trying to take anything from her. She allowed herself just for a moment to feel how tired she was. Not the tired that came from walking in July heat with a baby and a canvas bag, the other kind. The kind that had been building for 4 years through Thomas's sickness, through the death of their first child, through the slow gray year after, through Thomas himself, dying without ever quite letting her grieve beside him, through Boyd's first visit with his lawyer and his righteous smile, through every town that had looked at her and seen a problem rather than a person. That tired. She put her face in her hands. She didn't cry. She'd learned not to cry too deeply, because Lily always knew somehow even asleep, and would wake startled and afraid. She just breathed. Then she straightened up, pressed her hands flat on the table, and made herself a promise the way she'd been making herself promises since she was 22 years old, quietly without witnesses, without expectation of reward. You will not let Crane take her. You will not let Boyd take her. You will figure out what comes next, and you will not fall apart in a stranger's kitchen. She went to bed. She slept for the first time in weeks without waking once. Elijah lay on his back in the dark and stared at the ceiling. Across the hall, through the wall, he could hear nothing. Just the house settling in the heat, the distant coyote, the cicada chorus thinning out toward midnight. But he knew she was there. The way you know a fire is lit in the next room, even when you can't see it, some shift in the air, some change in the quality of the silence. He thought about what Hector had said. Crane don't forget, and he don't forgive. Elijah knew Aldous Crane. Not well, but enough. The man had come to Dustfall 5 years ago with a leather Bible and a wagon full of certainty, and within 2 years he'd made himself necessary to half the county, to Judge Whitmore, to the land office, to the merchants who needed his congregation's business. He spoke the language of frontier morality, which was the same as frontier fear, which was, we are surrounded by chaos, and God is watching, and anyone who steps outside the line deserves what happens to them. Elijah had sat in his pew twice out of obligation when Margaret was alive. She'd gripped his hand during the sermons and said afterward quietly, "He frightens me." Not the fire and brimstone part, the smile at the end. He'd thought about that smile often in the years since. He thought about Clara's voice saying, "I watched him do it to 2 others before me." He turned onto his side. Outside his window, the Kansas night pressed down warm and thick, and the stars burned bright over his fence line, over his burned gold grass, over the grave at the edge of his property, that he'd kept clear of weeds because he couldn't make himself stop. Margaret would have had opinions
This story
about all
was
of
posted
this.
on the channel
She
The
would have
Rusty
had Clara
Saddle.
settled
Please
into
do
the
not
good room,
repost
not
it in
the
any
storage
form.
room. Would have been asking about the baby's name, about whether Lily had started teething about what Clara liked to cook. Would have been deciding they were friends before supper was done. He almost smiled. Then the familiar weight came down and the almost smile went away. He closed his eyes. From the other side of the wall, nothing. Just breathing slow and even that he couldn't actually hear, but imagined anyway. Tomorrow Hector would come back with whatever he'd decided to bring from the store. Tomorrow, the routine would need adjusting. Tomorrow, there would be decisions to make about what story to tell Dustfall if anyone came asking, and whether to go into town first to get ahead of the narrative, and what Crane might do when he found out where Clara had landed. All of that was tomorrow. Tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Elijah Cross fell asleep before midnight. Down the hall, Lily turned in her sleep, reached out one small hand and closed her fingers around nothing, and then relaxed, sighing as if she'd found what she was looking for. The house held all three of them. The summer night pressed close and hot around the walls. And on the fence post beside the gate, the notice that Boyd Hayes' lawyer had nailed up in Wichita 3 weeks ago. Wanted. Clara Hayes, whereabouts. Unknown child abduction contact. Reverend A. Crane, Dustfall, Kansas, curled slowly in the hot wind, unstuck one corner from the wood, and fell into the dust of the road. Clara was already up when Elijah came downstairs the next morning. Not just up, she'd built the fire, put the coffee on, and was standing at the counter with Lily, propped against her hip, working through the inventory of his kitchen cabinet, with the focused expression of a woman calculating how far 12 things could stretch. She didn't turn around when he came in. "You're low on cornmeal, and your salt pork's going to turn in this heat if you don't smoke it or use it within 3 days." Elijah stopped in the doorway. "Good morning?" "Good morning." She turned then and handed him the coffee cup she'd already poured. "I didn't go through anything except the kitchen. I want you to know that." "I know. She paused. "I wanted to say it." He took the cup. Lily stared at him with the wide, unblinking assessment of a baby who has not yet learned to pretend she isn't looking. Her eyes were brown, like her mother's, and held the same unnerving directness. "She always stare at people like that," he said. "Since she was 2 months old." Clara shifted Lily to the other hip. "Thomas used to say she was sizing up whether you were worth her time." Something moved across her face, the briefest shadow, and then was gone. He wasn't wrong. Elijah drank his coffee and looked at the baby. Lily continued her assessment, chewing thoughtfully on her own fist. "She's decided you're acceptable," Clara said. "She'd be crying otherwise." High praise. Highest she gives. He almost said something, decided against it. Set his cup down and went to deal with the horses. Hector arrived before 9 with a wagon bed half full of supplies: flour, sugar, canned goods, a bolt of plain cotton cloth, and a block of ice wrapped in burlap that was already sweating in the July heat. "Ice," Elijah said, "for the baby." Hector lifted it down without asking for help. "Fever can come fast in this heat. You want it or not?" "I want it." Clara came to the door when she heard the wagon. She looked at the supplies, and her expression went careful and still in the way Elijah was already learning meant she was about to argue. Hector pointed at her before she opened her mouth. "Strategy," he said, "not charity. You being healthy means you being useful. You being useful means Elijah's got a legitimate reason to keep you on this property. Don't make my logic harder than it needs to be." Clara closed her mouth. Hector looked satisfied. "Good. Now come help me with the flour." They worked together unloading the wagon, and Elijah watched Hector talk to Clara. Not the careful, abbreviated way Hector talked to most people, but with the particular ease of a man who respected someone he'd only just met. Clara asked questions, practical ones. About Dustfall, about Judge Whitmore, about the specific nature of the legal arrangement Boyd Hayes was trying to construct. Hector answered all of them straight. Crane's argument is that you abandoned the estate, Hector said, setting a crate on the porch, which technically legally gives Boyd grounds to petition for the land and simultaneously question your fitness as a guardian. And Whitmore will hear it. Whitmore will hear anything Crane brings him. That's the arrangement. Is there anyone on that bench who isn't in Crane's pocket? Hector paused. Circuit judge comes through twice a year, next time September. That's 2 months. Yes, ma'am. Clara was quiet for a moment. She shifted the flour sack to her other arm and looked out past the barn, past the property line toward the direction of Dustfall, though you couldn't see it from here. 2 months, she said again, like she was measuring the distance between now and then. 2 months, Hector confirmed. He picked up the last crate. Lot can happen in 2 months. Lot can happen in 2 days, she said. He looked at her. That's true too. It was Elijah who first understood that Clara Hayes was not someone who waited. He understood it 3 days after she arrived when he came back from the east pasture at midday and found her in the yard with Pete, his 16-year-old ranch hand, teaching him to read from a primer she'd found in the box of books he'd meant to donate to the church school and hadn't gotten around to. Pete was 17 letters into the alphabet and sweating from more than the heat. You're not stupid, Clara was saying when Elijah walked up. You're rushing. Slow down. The letter doesn't change just because you're nervous about it. I ain't nervous, Pete said. Your hand is shaking. It's hot. Pete. Her voice was patient but not soft. Look at the letter. What does it look like? Pete stared at the page. Like a tent. Kind of. Exactly like a tent. And what letter lives in a tent? A. Say it like you know it. A. There you go. She turned the page. Next one. Elijah stood and watched this for a moment. Pete noticed him and went red, and Clara looked up without embarrassment. He's been wanting to learn, she said. He told me this morning. I didn't say that exactly, Pete muttered. He said he wished he could read the notices in town without having to ask someone what they said. I interpreted that as wanting to learn. She looked at Elijah steadily. Do you mind? No, Elijah said. Good. She turned back to Pete. Next letter. That evening, when Pete had gone home and Lily was asleep and the kitchen was clean, Clara sat at the table with a piece of paper and wrote out a careful list of what she needed to establish legal residency in Dustfall County. What documents, what witnesses, what filings. She'd been carrying the knowledge of frontier property law around in her head since Boyd's first visit, the way a person carries emergency provisions. Elijah sat across from her and read the list when she slid it to him. You know this already, he said. I looked it up after Boyd came the first time. 3 different law books from the Wichita Lending Library. She folded her hands on the table. I knew he'd try something. I just didn't know what shape it would take. Employment contract would help, Elijah said. Yes. Hector can witness it. I know. She paused. I don't want you to think I'm using you. Elijah looked up from the list. You told me that already. I'm telling you again because the situation makes it look that way. I'm living in your house. I'm asking you to put your name on documents. I'm aware of how that reads to people. Clara. He said her name the way she'd said his that first day testing the weight. I know what you're doing and I know why. I'd rather know than not know. He slid the list back. Write up the contract. I'll sign it tomorrow. She took the paper, looked at it for a moment. Your wife, she said. He went still. I saw the grave. I'm not asking about her, that's yours. She looked up. I just want you to know that I understand what it costs you to have someone in this house again, and I don't take it lightly. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the summer night had softened some, though not much. A moth was hitting itself against the lamp glass in the slow, repetitive way of creatures that don't know when to quit. Her name was Margaret, Elijah said. Clara nodded. Said nothing. She'd have had opinions about
This
all
story
of
was
this,
posted
he
on the
said.
channel The
She
Rusty
had
Saddle.
opinions about
Please
everything.
do not repost it in any
He
form.
paused. You'd have liked her. Would she have liked me? He thought about it, genuinely. Yes, he said. But she'd have told you that you hold your shoulders too high. Clara blinked. Then she laughed, a short, surprised sound like something she hadn't meant to let out. She pressed her hand over her mouth, and the laugh subsided, but it had been real, and he felt it like a window opening in a room that had been closed too long. Too high, she repeated. Like you're waiting to duck. Maybe I am. Maybe, he said. But you're inside now. She looked at him across the table. Something settled in her expression, not softness exactly, but a reduction in the guarding, the lowering of one barrier among many. Then Lily started crying from down the hall, and Clara stood immediately, the moment folding closed behind her, and the kitchen was just a kitchen again. Elijah sat there another minute. Then he got up, rinsed his cup, and went to bed. Hector brought the news on a Thursday, 9 days after Clara arrived. He came in looking like a man carrying something heavy and trying not to show it, which on Hector meant his jaw was set, and he didn't pour himself coffee right away, which was as close as Hector got to visible distress. Boyd Hayes is in Dustfall, he said. Clara, who was mending one of Pete's shirts at the table, set down the needle. She didn't look up. He came in yesterday with a man from the Missouri Territorial Court, some kind of legal representative. Met with Crane for 2 hours. Hector sat down. Crane called a community meeting for Sunday. Says he has evidence of child abandonment and wants the county to weigh in. He can't weigh in on a territorial matter, Elijah said. No, Hector said. But he can make enough noise that Whitmore feels obligated to open a formal hearing. And once it's a formal hearing, it's on the record, and on the record is where Crane is most dangerous. Clara had gone very still. Not the stillness of fear, the stillness of a woman thinking fast. What does Boyd want? Elijah said. The land. That's all he ever wanted. Hector looked at Clara. The child is leverage. That's my read. That's the right read, Clara said. Her voice was flat and precise. He doesn't want Lily. He wants me to give up the land claim to get her back if they take her. It's the same play he tried in Wichita, just with a longer reach. She finally looked up. He thinks I'll break. Will you? Hector said. Not unkindly, just directly. No. Then we need to get ahead of this before Sunday. Hector looked at Elijah. Employment contract needs to be filed today. We need 2 character witnesses besides me, preferably men, Whitmore respects. And Clara needs to be seen in Dustfall, calmly, not hiding. If I go into Dustfall, Clara began. If you don't go into Dustfall, you're the woman who ran, Hector said. Crane writes that story himself, and you've already lost. Clara looked at Elijah. He looked back at her. It's your call, he said. It's always your call. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the summer heat bore down on the yard, and somewhere in the distance, Pete was talking to the horses, the way he did when he thought no one was listening, low apologetic, like they were people he'd somehow wronged. All right, Clara said. Tomorrow. They went to Dustfall the next morning, Elijah driving the wagon, Clara beside him with Lily in her lap, both of them dressed plainly and deliberately, which was its own kind of statement. The town wasn't large. A main street with a handful of businesses, a church at the far end, a land office next to the livery. People noticed them immediately. People always noticed immediately in towns this size. Elijah kept the wagon at an even pace and looked straight ahead, and Clara held Lily against her chest and did the same. At the general store, Ruth Calloway looked up from behind the counter when they came in. She was a woman in her late 50s with a practical face and careful eyes that had seen enough of the world to know when they were watching something significant. She'd met Clara once before, briefly weeks ago, when Clara had come through town trying not to be noticed. She'd been polite in the way of women who are reserving judgment. Today, her expression was harder to read. "Mr. Cross," she said. "Morning, Ruth." Elijah set his list on the counter. "Need to fill this if you've got it." Ruth looked at the list, looked at Clara, looked at Lily, who was looking back with her customary unsettling directness. "I heard you'd taken on a housekeeper," Ruth said, neutral, not unfriendly, but not warm. "Word travels," Elijah said. "In Dustfall it does." Ruth began pulling items from the shelf behind her. "Also heard Boyd Hayes is in town." "We heard that too," Clara said. Ruth glanced at her. Something in her expression shifted, a slight tightening, or maybe a slight releasing. It was difficult to tell which. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" Ruth set a tin of coffee on the counter. "Honestly, someone more—" She paused. "Someone who looked like trouble." "I don't look like trouble." "You look like a schoolteacher." "I was a schoolteacher." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. "Crane's going to make things difficult for anyone who helps you. You should know that. He's already spoken to the Merchants Association about who they do business with." She said this matter-of-factly, not as a threat, just as the landscape. "This is what it looks like out here, watch your step." "I know," Clara said. "He did the same thing in Wichita. And I'm still here." Ruth picked up the list again. Something in the set of her mouth changed, something small but real. She finished filling the order without speaking, and when Elijah went to pay, she named a price 2 cents lower than it should have been. Neither of them mentioned it. Outside, Boyd Hayes was standing across the street. Clara saw him. Before Elijah did, she went absolutely still in the way she had when something cost her, and Elijah, who was loading the wagon, looked up at her face and then turned to follow her gaze. Boyd Hayes was a stocky man in his 40s with Thomas's eyes and a meaner face. He was standing with a younger man in a city suit, the legal representative from Missouri by the look of him, and he was looking at Clara the way a man looks at something he believes he owns. He smiled when he saw her see him. Clara looked straight back at him. Neither of them moved. The street between them was 20 feet of packed summer dirt, and 10 years of everything Boyd Hayes had done to make her afraid of him, and Clara stood in it and did not blink. Elijah came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything, didn't touch her, just stood there visible, and looked across the street at Boyd Hayes with the specific expression of a man who has stood between things and other things before, and knows exactly how much space he is willing to hold. Boyd's smile faded slightly. The legal representative leaned in and said something to him. Boyd answered without looking away from Clara. Then slowly, deliberately, he turned and walked in the other direction. Clara let out a breath through her nose, very controlled. "He'll go straight to Crane," she said. "Yes," Elijah said. "And Crane will move up whatever he's planning." "Probably." She looked at the baby in her arms. Lily had watched the entire exchange without making a sound. Dark eyes tracking back and forth between her mother and the man across the street, and now she turned and looked up at Elijah and made a sound, low questioning, like she was asking him something she needed a straight answer to. He looked down at her. "We're all right," he said. His voice was rough and low and entirely serious. The voice of a man who did not make promises he didn't intend to keep. "We're all right." Lily considered this. Then she reached out and grabbed a fistful of his shirt and held on. He didn't pull away. Clara watched him look down at her daughter's hand on his shirt. Watched something move across his face. Something old and complicated and quietly devastating. And she thought of Margaret's grave at the edge of his property, and the cradle that was somewhere in this house, still packed away in one of those boxes, and the weight that a man carries when love has already cost him everything, and he opens the gate anyway. She put her hand briefly on his arm. Not a gesture of romance. Something simpler and more serious than that. The acknowledgement between two people who have both lost enough to understand exactly what the other one is risking. He nodded once. They got in the wagon and drove back through Dustfall.
This story
the
was
same way
posted
they'd
on the
come,
channel The
even
Rusty
paced straight
Saddle.
ahead,
Please do
and
not
neither of them
repost it
spoke
in any
until the
form.
town was behind them and the open Kansas road stretched out into the shimmering gold distance. "Sunday," Clara said. "Sunday." Elijah agreed. The cicadas sang their one loud note in every direction, and the summer pressed close around them, and somewhere behind them in Dustfall, Reverend Aldous Crane was already sharpening whatever he planned to say. Sunday came in hot and still, the way Kansas Sundays did in July, the air so thick by 8 in the morning that breathing felt like work, the sky a hard flat blue with no mercy in it. Clara was dressed before Elijah came downstairs. Plain gray dress hair pinned back Lily in her arms in the cleanest wrap she owned. She was standing at the kitchen window when he appeared in the doorway, and she turned and looked at him and didn't say good morning because they were past the part of this where small talk served any purpose. "You sure about this?" he said. "No." She adjusted Lily on her hip. "Let's go anyway." Hector was waiting at the crossroads a half-mile from the church with Thomas Greer, a rancher from the North County who ran 300 head of cattle and owed Elijah a favor from the winter of 1875, and Thomas's wife Mary, who had said simply when Hector had asked that she'd seen Crane do this before to a woman in the next county, and she wasn't going to watch it happen again without saying so. Thomas was a big, quiet man with a sunburned neck and honest eyes. He tipped his hat to Clara when she climbed down from the wagon. "Ma'am," he said, "we'll stand with you." "You don't have to," Clara said. "I know I don't have to." He said it the same way Elijah said things, as if the fact that it was a choice was the only part that mattered. "That's why I'm here." Mary Greer put her hand briefly on Clara's arm, said nothing. Sometimes nothing was exactly right. The five of them walked into the Dustfall Community Church together. Every head turned. The church was full, which was unusual for a summer Sunday, which meant word had gotten out, which meant Crane had made sure word had gotten out. Clara felt the eyes come at her, the way heat comes off a stove, not violent, but impossible to ignore. She walked to the fourth row from the front, sat down, settled Lily in her lap, and looked straight ahead. Elijah sat beside her. Hector took the end of the row. Thomas and Mary filled the gap. The murmuring that ran through the congregation lasted about 30 seconds. Then Reverend Aldous Crane stepped up to the pulpit, and the room went quiet. Crane was a tall man, lean in the way of men who believed physical comfort was spiritually suspect. He had a face designed for conviction, strong jaw, deep-set eyes, the kind of mouth that could make an ordinary sentence sound like a verdict. He surveyed his congregation with the measured patience of a man who had prepared for exactly this and wanted them to know it. "We gather today," he began, not in judgment, but in concern. Clara's hands tightened slightly on Lily. "Concern for the welfare of a child." He paused. Let it land. "Concern for the moral foundations of this community. And concern, genuine Christian concern for a man who has shown himself in better times to be a pillar of this county." He didn't look at Elijah when he said it. He didn't need to. Everyone else did. Elijah sat with his arms crossed, and his face showing nothing. "Boyd Hayes has come a long way," Crane continued, "to seek justice for his deceased brother's child. He has provided documentation from the Missouri Territorial Court establishing his legal claim to guardianship of the infant girl currently in this room. He has provided evidence." And here Crane lifted a sheaf of papers slowly, the way a man lifts a weapon he wants the room to see before he uses it. That Clara Hayes abandoned the estate of her deceased husband, fled a legal proceeding, and has been living for the past week and a half under the roof of an unmarried man. The murmuring came back louder this time. "I want to speak," Clara said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was clear, and it cut straight through the murmuring. Several people near her startled. Crane looked at her for the first time since she'd sat down. His expression was exactly what she'd feared, not hostile, not angry. Tolerant. The expression of a man who had already decided the outcome, and found the process mildly entertaining. "Miss Hayes," he said, "you'll have opportunity to respond." She said. "Mrs. Hayes." A small thing. But the room heard it, and Crane heard it, and something moved behind his eyes, the first flicker of something that wasn't entirely controlled. "Mrs. Hayes," he corrected pleasantly. "In time." Boyd was seated in the front row on the opposite side of the aisle, the legal representative from Missouri beside him, with a leather case on his knee. Boyd didn't look at Clara. He looked at his hands folded in his lap, with the expression of a man performing grief for an audience. Clara had seen that expression across a kitchen table in Missouri when Boyd had told her he only wanted what was best for Thomas's memory. She'd believed him for approximately 45 minutes, which was how long it had taken her to find the document he'd had drafted already signed by 2 witnesses transferring the land title to his name. The testimonies came first. Mrs. Alderton, who ran the boarding house, said she'd heard from a reliable source that Clara Hayes had left Wichita under suspicious circumstances. She didn't specify what the suspicious circumstances were. She didn't need to. The word suspicious did its work, and she sat back down. A man named Garrett, who worked at the land office, said he'd checked the Missouri records, and the estate had indeed been left without proper administration when Clara departed. He said this with the apologetic precision of a man who was genuinely sorry to be useful to Crane, but not sorry enough to stay home. Then Boyd stood. He was a decent performer, Clara had always known that. He turned to face the congregation with Thomas's eyes in his meaner face, and he said quietly that he'd loved his brother. That Thomas had worried in his final months about the child's future. That Thomas had spoken to Boyd about his concerns regarding Clara's, and here Boyd paused, searched for the word with theatrical care and stability. "He said that to me 3 weeks before he died," Boyd said. "I didn't want to believe it. I tried to help her, offered to manage the estate on her behalf. She refused." He shook his head slowly. "Then she ran. In the middle of the night, took my niece and ran, and I've been trying to find them for months. Not for the land." He looked up, and his eyes were wet, which Clara had also seen before, and which cost him nothing. For the child. For Thomas's daughter. The room was very quiet. Clara looked at Lily in her lap. Lily was looking at Boyd Hayes with her customary directness, and her expression, insofar as an 8-month-old had expressions that could be read, was one of deep suspicion. Clara pressed her lips together. "Mrs. Hayes," Crane's voice smooth as still water. "Would you like to respond?" She stood. Lily settled against her shoulder, and Clara felt the weight of her daughter real and warm in breathing, and it steadied her the way it always did. "Thomas Hayes was a good man," she said. "He was kind, and he was honest, and he worked himself half to death trying to build something worth leaving to his daughter." She looked at Boyd. "He didn't talk to his brother about concerns regarding my instability. He talked to his brother as little as possible because Boyd had been cheating him on shared grazing rights for 4 years, and Thomas was too decent to say so out loud." A sound ran through the room. Boyd's jaw tightened. "The document Boyd brought to me 3 weeks after Thomas died wasn't a management arrangement." Clara continued, her voice still level. "It was a full transfer of title. He'd had it drawn up before Thomas's body was cold." She looked at Crane. "If this is a proceeding concerned with documentation, I'd like to know why Boyd's document is in evidence and mine isn't." Crane's expression didn't change. "What documentation are you referring to?" Clara reached into her dress pocket and produced a folded paper. She'd had it on her person since Missouri sewn into her bag lining until last night, when she'd taken it out and pressed it flat and put it where she could reach it. She held it up. "My husband's will, witnessed by 2 people in Wichita, leaving the homestead and everything on it to me and to Lily, with no provision for Boyd Hayes under any circumstance." She paused. "I'd like this entered into the record, whatever record you're keeping here." Hector stood. He crossed to the front of the room and took the document from Clara's hand and placed it on the small table near the pulpit with the deliberate authority of a man who had decided this was where he was putting it and anyone who wanted to argue could take that up with him directly. Nobody argued. Crane looked at the document, looked at Clara. "A will can be contested," he said. "By whom?" Clara said. Thomas had no other living immediate family. Boyd is a brother-in-law. In the Missouri territorial statutes, a surviving spouse and child supersede a sibling-in-law's claim in every category. She looked at him steadily. "I taught myself property law from the Wichita Lending Library, Reverend Crane. I had about 18 months while my husband was dying to get very familiar with the relevant statutes. Would you like to test that?" The silence in the room had changed quality. Earlier, it had been the silence of people waiting to see something confirmed. Now it was the silence of people reconsidering.
This story was
Boyd
posted
stood.
on the channel The
"She's
Rusty
coached,"
Saddle.
he
Please
said,
do not
and the
repost it
veneer
in
of
any
grief
form.
had slipped, now something harder underneath. "She's been coached by someone. This is—" "Sit down, Boyd." Elijah's voice came from the fourth row, quiet and absolute. And it stopped Boyd Hayes, the way a hand on a horse's halter stops a horse complete and immediate. Boyd turned to look at him. "You stay out of this, Cross. This isn't your business. You're standing in a church calling a woman a liar in front of 50 people, Elijah said. He hadn't moved. His arms were still crossed. His voice hadn't risen. "That's my business." "She's living in your house," Boyd said. And now he aimed it like a weapon, his voice going loud enough for the room. "She came to you for a reason. You're helping her obstruct a legal—" "She came to my gate half dead in a July heat wave with an infant," Elijah said. "And I brought them inside. Same as any man in this room would have done." He let that sit for a moment, the implied challenge of it, any man in this room. "And then I hired her legally with a contract witnessed by Hector Vance and Thomas Greer, because she is a qualified, educated woman who needed work and I needed help. That is the complete extent of it." Crane cleared his throat. "Nevertheless, the impropriety of the arrangement." "Reverend." Elijah turned his gaze to Crane. "I have known you for 5 years. I've watched you use this pulpit to strip 2 women in this county of what was legally theirs. I watched you take Agnes Barlow's farm on a morality argument after her husband died, and I said nothing because it wasn't my place, and I was too deep in my own grief to see what you were doing clearly." He uncrossed his arms. "I see it clearly now." The room was profoundly still. "You aren't doing this for Thomas Hayes's memory," Elijah said. "You're doing it because Clara Hayes refused to be afraid of you, and that is the one thing you cannot tolerate." He looked at the congregation, swept his gaze across the pews in a single deliberate pass. "And I am asking everyone in this room to consider whether they want to be part of that. Whether that is the Christianity they came here for." Mrs. Alderton in the third row looked at her hands. Garrett from the land office looked at the window. Ruth Calloway in the back row, where Clara hadn't noticed her, was looking at Elijah with an expression that was entirely unreadable. Crane had regained his composure. He was very good at regaining his composure. "Your defense of her is noted, Elijah, but this proceeding—" "This isn't a proceeding," Hector said from where he stood near the front. His voice carried the full weight of a man who'd been quiet for long enough. "This is a church, and what's happening in it right now doesn't have much to do with God." Someone in the back, Clara couldn't see who, made a sound of quiet agreement. Crane's eyes went to Hector. Something moved in them, not anger exactly, calculation. The reassessment of a man who'd expected this to go a particular way and was now adjusting. "Mr. Vance," he said, "your opinion is—" "My opinion is the same as it's always been," Hector said. "That a man with a Bible and a land office in his pocket is more dangerous than a man with a gun. And that this county has let you be dangerous for long enough." Crane stood very straight. His voice went cold. "There will be a formal hearing. Judge Whitmore has agreed to convene on Friday. At that hearing, the documentation will be reviewed and a determination made regarding the child's placement." He looked at Clara. "I would advise you not to leave the county." "I'm not going anywhere," Clara said. "No," Boyd said from the front row. He looked at her with Thomas's eyes gone mean, and for a moment, something genuine showed through the performance. Not grief, not righteousness, just the flat, ugly face of a man who had decided he would win this and would not be stopped. "You're not." They filed out into the white July sun, and the congregation dispersed around them in clusters, and nobody spoke directly to Clara, except Mary Greer, who pressed her hand briefly and said, "Friday," like a promise. Elijah walked to the wagon and didn't speak. Clara settled Lily against her shoulder and looked at the church behind them, at Crane still visible through the open doorway, talking to Boyd Hayes and the legal representative. Their voices didn't carry. She didn't need to hear them. She knew what was happening. Crane was flexible. She'd seen this in Wichita too. When a direct route closed, he found another one. He had until Friday, and he would use every hour of it. "He'll go after you directly," she said to Elijah. "I know. Your business, your reputation, anything he can use." She turned to look at him. "You said I'd already ruined you, but that was—" She stopped. "I mean it. He will make it real if he can." Elijah looked at her. The sun was brutal behind him, and he squinted against it, which made him look less severe and more just tired. Tired in the particular way of a man who had been carrying something for 3 years and had recently picked up more. "Clara," he said, "do you trust me?" She thought about the question honestly. Trust wasn't something she handed out easily. Trust had been educated out of her one disappointment at a time. She thought about the employment contract signed without conditions. About the ice for Lily's fever that hadn't come yet but might. About the way he'd said, "We're all right" to her daughter in the street, as if he meant it all the way down. "Yes," she said. "I trust you." "Then let me handle Crane." "That's not instead of you," he said. "With you, there's a difference." He looked at her steadily. "You handled that room better than I could have. You had the will, you had the statutes, you had Boyd's face when you read them out." Something in his expression shifted, not a smile, but the thing that lived near where a smile might be. Margaret would have stood up and cheered. Clara's chest tightened. She looked away out across the road toward the Kansas distance. "Friday," she said. "Friday," he said. Hector appeared at Elijah's shoulder, and the easy exchange closed behind them like water. "Boyd's hired 2 more men," Hector said quietly. "Saw them ride in this morning. They're at the hotel." Elijah's jaw set. "What kind of men?" "The kind you hire when you want something handled before it gets to a courtroom." Hector looked at Clara. "You understand what I'm saying?" She understood. She'd understood since the moment she'd climbed onto the dead horse's back outside of Wichita and ridden until it couldn't carry her anymore. Boyd Hayes had one mode when he was losing, and it wasn't legal. Lily made a sound against her shoulder, a small, uncertain sound, the kind that meant she was tired, but fighting it, which was something she'd gotten Clara thought from her mother entirely. "Come on," Clara said. She meant it to both of them. "Let's go home." And they did. Elijah driving Hector riding alongside on his old gray horse the Kansas road, stretching out in the heat, and behind them the church growing smaller, and the problem it contained growing no smaller at all. That night, after Lily was down and Hector had gone, Clara found Elijah sitting on the porch in the dark. He had a glass of water and was looking out toward the property line, toward the grave marker, just visible in the moonlight, the way he sometimes did when he thought no one was watching. She sat in the other chair without asking. They sat for a long time without speaking, and the summer night held them in its close, hot hands, and somewhere out in the dark beyond the fence line, the cicadas had finally gone quiet, which made the silence feel very large and very real. "He came here today," Elijah said. "Boyd." Clara turned sharply. "While we were in church. Pete saw his men on the East Road." His voice was even, but she heard what was underneath it. "They were looking at the property line." She said nothing for a moment. Then, "How close?" "Close enough." He turned to look at her. His face in the moonlight was hard to read, but his eyes were clear. "I need you to understand something. What happens Friday, whatever Whitmore decides, I'm not going to let him take her." Clara held still. The certainty in his voice was not the certainty of a man making a promise lightly. It was something older and more serious than that. The certainty of a man who had already decided
The story was posted on the channel The
and was
Rusty
simply
Saddle.
informing her
Please
of the
do not
decision.
repost it in any form.
She felt something shift in her chest, a cracking open quiet and irreversible. "Elijah," she said. "I know what it costs," he said. "I'm not asking you for anything. I'm just telling you." He looked back out at the dark. "She's not going to Boyd Hayes, whatever I have to do." Clara pressed her hand over her mouth for a moment. Not grief. Something more complicated than grief, the specific feeling of being defended by someone who had no obligation to defend you, who did it anyway, who asked nothing back. She lowered her hand. "You might lose everything," she said quietly. "Your land, your standing, everything you've built. I know. And you're still—" "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment in the dark. At the set of his shoulders, the exhaustion in his jaw, the particular dignity of a man who had grieved deeply and chosen anyway to come back to the living. "I'm not going to let him take her either," she said. "Just so you know." The corner of his mouth moved. "I know. I just wanted to say it. I heard you." They sat together in the darkness, two people who had each lost enough to understand exactly what the next 3 days could cost them, and said nothing more. And the night settled around the house, and inside it, Lily slept soundly warm and whole, and entirely unaware of how many decisions were being made on her behalf by people who had only known her for 11 days and already could not imagine letting anything happen to her. The 3 days between Sunday and Friday moved the way time moves when something is coming, that you can't stop too fast in the nights, too slow in the days, and with a quality of unreality underneath everything, like the world had gone slightly out of register with itself. Monday passed in work. Clara taught Pete his letters in the morning, and spent the afternoon going through the legal documents with Hector, who had ridden out from town with a copy of the Missouri Territorial Statutes, borrowed from the land office, under circumstances he declined to elaborate on. They sat at the kitchen table for 4 hours, Clara reading, and Hector listening, and both of them building the shape of what Friday needed to look like. Elijah came in and out adding things, when he had them, leaving when he didn't. He wasn't a man who performed usefulness. He either had something to contribute, or he got out of the way, which Clara was finding she respected more with each passing day. Tuesday brought the first real trouble. It came in the form of Pete, who arrived at the ranch an hour late with a cut above his left eyebrow and the specific expression of a boy trying very hard to look like a man who wasn't bothered. Elijah saw it first. "What happened?" Not a question. Pete's jaw worked. "Boyd's men were at the crossroads," he said. 3 of them. "They stopped me on the road and said—" He stopped, glanced at Clara, who was standing in the doorway. "They said things. And then one of them grabbed my collar and said to tell Mr. Cross that private property don't mean what he thinks it means when a judge says otherwise." The kitchen went very quiet. Elijah looked at Pete for a long moment. "They touch you anywhere else?" "No, sir." "The cut?" "I fell when he let go. That's all." Pete lifted his chin slightly. "I didn't say anything back. I know you told me to keep my head down in town." "You did right." Elijah put his hand briefly on the boy's shoulder, a rare gesture, and Pete understood the weight of it and stood straighter. "Go clean that up. You're done for today." "I can still work." "Pete." His voice was quiet. "Go home." After Pete left, Clara looked at Elijah. He was already at the counter, not moving, just standing there with his hands flat on the wood, the way he did when he was thinking through something he didn't want to say out loud yet. "They're not going to wait for Friday," she said. "No," he said. "They're going to try to make something happen before Friday that changes what Friday looks like." Meaning, he turned. meaning if Boyd can create enough of a disturbance, get Whitmore to issue a temporary removal order before the hearing. He doesn't have to win the hearing. He just has to make enough noise that Lily gets placed somewhere while the case runs, and then the case runs as long as Boyd needs it to, while he burns through whatever money I have trying to fight it from a distance. Clara had known this. She'd known it the way she'd known all of Boyd's moves, because Boyd was not inventive. He was persistent, which was worse. But hearing it said out loud in someone else's voice made it land differently, made it real in a way she'd been keeping at arm's length by staying busy. She sat down, not in defeat, just because her legs decided they'd been standing for a while. He did the same thing in Wichita, she said. Not with hired men, with reputation. He went to every merchant Thomas had ever done business with and told them I was unstable. Within 2 weeks, I couldn't buy flour without someone looking at me like I was something to be managed. She looked at her hands. I thought leaving would stop it. I thought if I just got far enough away. It followed you, Elijah said. He followed me. She corrected it without sharpness. Boyd doesn't want the land because he needs it. He wants it because Thomas had it, and Thomas was always the better man, and Boyd has spent 40 years being furious about that. She paused. Lily is proof that Thomas built something real. Boyd can't stand that she exists. Elijah pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Tell me something, he said. The witnesses in Wichita, are they reachable? One is Margaret Ellison. She runs a seamstress shop on 5th Street. She signed it and watched Thomas sign it, and she'd say so under oath. Can Hector get a deposition? In 3 days. Hector knows a man with a fast horse and a law license, Elijah said. It's not ideal, but a deposition in hand is better than a witness no one's thought to ask. Clara looked at him. You've been thinking about this. Since Sunday. You didn't say anything. I didn't have anything solid yet. He held her gaze. I don't move until I have something solid. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, Elijah, why are you doing this? He didn't answer immediately, which meant she'd learned that he was going to answer honestly rather than quickly. She waited. Because what Crane is doing is wrong, he said. And I've watched wrong things happen in this county for 3 years, and said it wasn't my place, and kept my head down and worked my land. He paused. My wife used to say I had a highly developed talent for looking the other way. She didn't mean it as a compliment. He looked at the table. She was right. Clara said nothing. And because, he stopped, started again. Lily grabbed my shirt. Clara blinked. In town. On the street. She grabbed my shirt and held on. His voice was entirely level. I haven't had a child hold on to me in 3 years. And it turned out I wasn't as done with that feeling as I thought I was. Clara's throat tightened. She pressed her lips together and looked at the window and allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of feeling that, fully before she put it somewhere manageable. Hector, she said. Send him to Wichita tonight. Already planning to. And the testimony from Thomas Greer and Mary. They're coming Friday regardless. I spoke to Thomas this morning. She turned back to him. Is there anything you haven't already thought of? The corner of his mouth moved. Probably. That's why I'm telling you. Hector rode out that evening with a list of questions for Margaret Ellison in Wichita, and the name of the lawman with the fast horse, and a look on his face that said he would get it done, because he had never in his life failed to get a thing done once he'd decided to do it. Wednesday was the day Ruth Calloway came. She arrived mid-morning in a buggy unannounced, which was how everyone arrived at Elijah's property, and which Clara was starting to accept as a regional custom. She had a basket over one arm, and the expression of a woman who had made a decision and was not entirely comfortable with it, but had made it anyway. Clara opened the door before Ruth reached the porch. They looked at each other. I'm not here as Crane's person, Ruth said. I want you to know that before you close the door. I wasn't going to close the door. Ruth glanced at the basket. I brought preserves, and a rocking chair. She gestured behind her, where a small rocking chair was wedged into the back of the buggy. For the baby. I had it in my storeroom. It was my daughter's. She paused. She's grown and gone to Denver, and I thought... She stopped. I thought it shouldn't sit in a storeroom. Clara stepped back from the doorway. Come in. They sat at the kitchen table, and Ruth Calloway did not perform comfort or ease.
This story
She
was
sat
posted
like a
on the
woman who
channel
was
The
in a
Rusty
place she
Saddle.
wasn't sure
Please
she
do not
deserved to
repost
be
it in
and
any
knew it.
form.
I said things at the church meeting, she said. Afterward, in the groups outside. She looked at Clara directly. I didn't stand up against what Crane was doing. And what I said in those groups, it wasn't I was afraid of what he'd do to my business. I have 3 employees who need their wages, and the congregation buys a lot of dry goods. She stopped. That's an explanation, not an excuse. I know the difference, Clara said. I imagine you do. Ruth folded her hands on the table. My husband died 11 years ago. Crane tried to tell me what to do with his estate. I had a brother who stood up for me, and I kept my business and my house, and I've been grateful for it every day since. She looked at Lily, who was on the blanket on the floor working very seriously on the project of sitting up without falling sideways. That woman in the next county, the one Crane took the farm from. I knew her. I knew what he did, and I said nothing. The kitchen was quiet. I'll testify on Friday, Ruth said. About Crane's pattern, about Agnes Barlow, about what I've watched him do to women in this county who didn't have a brother to stand for them. Her voice was steady. I know it'll cost me. I've been thinking about it since Sunday, and I've decided I'd rather lose the congregation's business than look at that baby and know I did nothing. Clara looked at her for a long moment, at the careful, uncomfortable honesty of a woman who knew she'd been on the wrong side and was paying the cost of changing. It wasn't the performance of goodness. It was the real thing, messy and late and imperfect. Thank you, Clara said. She said it plainly, without warmth she didn't yet fully feel, and without coldness either. Just truth. I'll take the testimony. Lily chose that moment to successfully sit up without falling, looked around at the room with startled triumph, and then immediately fell sideways. She did not cry. She looked at the ceiling with an expression of profound philosophical reassessment, and then made a sound that was unmistakably a laugh. Ruth Calloway watched this, and something in her face broke open slightly, the held, careful expression giving way to something simpler. She's got a good spirit, she said. She gets it from her father, Clara said. And then, after a pause, and she's learning some new things. Thursday arrived, and with it a different kind of storm. Elijah was in the barn before dawn when he heard the horses on the road, too many of them moving too deliberately for travelers. He came out with a rifle and found 3 men at his gate. One he recognized as Boyd's legal representative from Missouri. The other 2 he didn't know, but he knew their type, the quiet, watchful kind of men who got paid for presence rather than conversation. The legal representative was named Cavett. He had the smooth, uninflected manner of a man accustomed to delivering unpleasant news as if it were a weather report. Mr. Cross, Cavett said, I have a document from Judge Whitmore granting temporary emergency custody of the infant Lily Hayes to Boyd Hayes pending Friday's hearing. You're required by law to produce the child by... No, Elijah said. Cavett blinked. In his experience, which was extensive, people did not say no to documents from judges. They said, I need to speak to someone, or let me read that carefully. Or surely there's been a misunderstanding. They did not say no, the way Elijah Cross said it, flat and final, and without apparent anxiety. Mr. Cross, I understand this is... That document, Elijah said, was signed by a judge who owes Reverend Crane 3 favors. It was obtained without notice to the child's mother, which violates territorial procedure. And it was brought here at 5 in the morning with 2 hired men, which tells me everything I need to know about how legitimate you believe it to be. He looked at Cavett with the specific expression of a man who has spent time deciding where his line is and has found it. "You're not taking that child today." The two men with Cavett shifted slightly. It was a small movement, barely perceptible, but Elijah saw it the way he saw everything completely, and without showing he'd seen it. "Gentlemen," he said, addressing the two men directly, "I was a federal investigator for 6 years before I came home to ranch. I know every legal and several extra-legal ways a confrontation at a private residence can resolve itself. I strongly recommend you consider which of those resolutions you'd prefer this to be." Neither man moved. Neither man moved forward either. Cavett cleared his throat. "This isn't finished, Mr. Cross." "I know. Friday is when it's finished." Elijah looked at him. "Get off my property." They went. Elijah stood at the gate for a long moment after they rode out. His heart was going faster than he'd let his face show, which was a skill he'd spent years developing and was grateful for now. Then he turned and found Clara standing 20 feet behind him. She had Lily on her hip and the look on her face of a woman who had heard everything. "Federal investigator," she said. 6 years. "You never mentioned that. You never asked about my work history." He walked toward her. "You all right?" "I'm yes." She looked at the gate. "He'll go back to Crane. Crane will try something else before morning." "I know." He took his hat off, ran a hand through his hair. "Hector's back from Wichita. He's got the deposition." Something in Clara's face loosened, just slightly. Margaret signed it. Had it witnessed by the lawman and sent her own letter to the circuit court in addition. He put his hat back on. She also sent a second letter to a newspaper in Wichita. In case Friday doesn't go the way it should. Clara stared at him. "You had a contingency." "I always have a contingency." She looked at him. Really looked the way she rarely let herself, and he stood and let her look, which was its own kind of answer. She was trying to understand what kind of man she was standing next to. Not because she was suspicious. Because she'd spent years being wrong about men and had learned to do her reading carefully. What she saw was this: a man who had loved someone and lost her and nearly lost himself entirely, and who had come back to the living not through healing exactly, but through stubbornness and probably the maintenance of fence lines and the particular mercy of having something to do with his hands every day. A man who was not gentle in the way of men who had never been tested, but careful in the way of men who had been broken and put themselves back together and knew which pieces were fragile. She had not been looking for this. She had been looking for a road and a chance, and enough distance between herself and Boyd Hayes to make a life for her daughter somewhere quiet. She had not been looking for someone who would stand at his gate at 5 in the morning and say no. And yet, "Elijah," she said. He waited. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she stopped. Looked at Lily, who was watching them both with her habitual gravity. "I need you to know that whatever happens tomorrow, you gave us something no one else has given us since Thomas died." "What's that?" "You took us seriously," she said. "Not as a problem to manage, not as a charity case, not as a complication." She looked at him directly. "As people who deserve to be here." Something moved through his face, complicated and quiet and real. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "You do deserve to be here." "I know that now." She said it without apology. "I'm just telling you that I know it partly because you acted like it was obvious." Lily reached out and grabbed Elijah's collar, which she had begun doing with some regularity, and tugged. He looked down at her. "We have work to do," he said. "To both of them." "We do," Clara agreed. They went inside together. That night, the last night before Friday, Clara could not sleep. She lay in the dark and listened to the house and went through every document in her mind. The will, the deposition, the territorial statutes, the letter from Margaret Ellison. She tested each one for weaknesses, the way you test ice, before you put your weight on it, looking for the place it would crack. Crane would challenge the will's witnesses. She had the answer. Crane would argue abandonment. She had the statutes. Crane would argue the living arrangement with Elijah was immoral. She had the employment contract, and she had Ruth Calloway, and she had Thomas Greer, and she had Mary. What she didn't have was certainty. Certainty wasn't available. Whitmore was Crane's man, and what happened in that courtroom tomorrow would depend on whether Whitmore was more afraid of Crane than he was of being wrong in public. She sat up. Across the hall she heard Elijah's floorboards, the particular creak of the third board from his door that she'd memorized by now. He was awake too.
This story was posted
got
on the
up,
channel The
went to the
Rusty
hall.
Saddle. Please do not
He was
repost
already
it
standing in
any
his
form.
doorway, and they looked at each other in the dark hallway, and neither of them spoke for a moment. "I keep going over it," she said. "Me too." "Are we ready?" He thought about it honestly, which she'd learned was the only way he thought about anything. "As ready as we can be," he said. "The rest depends on Whitmore." "What do you think he'll do?" "I think he's a man who doesn't like being embarrassed in public, and Crane has given him a case that if it goes wrong will look very bad on the record." He leaned against the doorframe. "I think Ruth Calloway talking about Agnes Barlow in open court is the thing Whitmore is least prepared for." Clara nodded slowly. "And if it still goes wrong?" "Then we appeal to the circuit judge." His voice was entirely steady. "And while we appeal, Lily stays here. Because no one is physically removing her from this property without going through me first, and that," he looked at her, "is not me being reckless. That is me being clear about what I'm willing to do." She looked at him in the dark hallway of his house in the last quiet before whatever Friday would bring, and felt something she hadn't felt in so long she'd nearly forgotten what to call it. Safe. Not because the danger was gone. The danger was fully present and would be in that courtroom in approximately 8 hours. But safe in the older sense, the sense of not being alone in the facing of it. The sense of having someone beside her who had chosen to be there. "Get some sleep," he said. "You too." He nodded, didn't move to go back in immediately. "Clara." She waited. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said, "you fought for her. Every step, every mile, every document in that pocket of yours." He looked at her. "Thomas would have been proud of you." She breathed in slowly through her nose, looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at him. "Go to sleep, Elijah," she said quietly. He almost smiled. "Yes, ma'am." He went back in. She went back in. The house held them both, and Lily slept on in her small room with the east-facing window, and outside the Kansas night was finally, briefly almost cool, the stars burning hard and clear overhead, and the morning was coming, whether they were ready for it or not. Friday came in without apology. The sun was already fierce by 7 in the morning, the kind of July heat that made the air above the road shimmer and waver, and the town of Dustfall was awake earlier than usual because word had gotten around the way word always got around in small places through back fences and general store counters and the particular telegraph of women talking to women across the distance of hanging laundry. Something was going to happen today. Everyone knew it. The only question was which direction it would fall. Clara dressed Lily in the cleanest thing she had, a white cotton dress with small yellow flowers that Mary Greer had sent over Thursday evening, with a note that said simply, "Wear this tomorrow, it matters what they see." Clara had looked at the dress for a long moment and understood. This was frontier courtroom strategy. Every detail told a story before anyone opened their mouth, and a baby in a white dress with yellow flowers told a story that was very difficult to argue against. She pinned her own hair carefully, put on the gray dress, looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand. Thomas used to say she looked like a schoolteacher, even when she was angry, which he'd meant as a compliment because he'd loved schoolteachers. She thought about that now. She straightened her collar, put the folded will in her left pocket, the deposition in her right, and the 2 pages of territorial statutes she'd copied out by hand in the inside pocket she'd sewn into the seam. She picked up Lily. "All right," she said. To herself, to Lily, to the small room with the east-facing window that had been a storage space 2 weeks ago, and had become somehow the safest place she'd slept in years. "All right." Elijah was waiting in the kitchen with coffee already poured and his good shirt on the dark blue one he'd worn to church on Sunday, the one that meant he understood this was a performance as much as a proceeding. He looked at her when she came in, and his eyes went to Lily, and then to the dress, and then to Clara's face. "Ready," he said. "No," she said. "Good." He handed her the coffee. "Means you're thinking clearly." Hector arrived at 8 with Thomas and Mary Greer and Ruth Calloway, all of them in the same wagon, which was the kind of detail that would not go unnoticed in Dustfall, and was not meant to. 5 people arriving together said something. It said, "We discussed this. We decided together. We are not here by accident." Ruth Calloway had dressed like a woman who owned a business and intended to keep owning it, which was its own kind of statement. She looked at Clara when she climbed down from the wagon and gave a single nod that carried more weight than most speeches. They went to Dustfall together. The hearing was held in the back room of the land office, which was the closest thing Dustfall had to a courtroom, a rectangular space with 2 tables, a row of chairs along one wall, and Judge Whitmore's desk positioned at the far end, with the careful authority of furniture that understands its symbolic function. The room was already full when they arrived. Word had done its work. Whitmore was a man in his 60s who had the face of someone who had spent decades making decisions he wasn't entirely proud of and had developed a complicated relationship with his own reflection because of it. He was not, Clara noted, looking at Crane when they walked in. He was looking at his desk. That was something. Boyd was already seated at the left table with Cavett beside him. Boyd looked at Clara when she entered with the expression he always used, patient sorrowful, the performance of a man reluctantly doing what was right. She looked back at him without expression. She had spent too long being frightened of that face. She was done with it. She sat at the right table. Elijah sat beside her. Hector took a position standing along the wall, which he'd decided was where he'd be most useful. Visible grounded a physical presence that said there were people here of substance who had made their choice. Crane was at the front of the room, not seated at either table, standing, which was how he was most comfortable. He had his Bible and his leather folder, and his expression of measured compassion, and he did not look at Elijah at all, which meant he was more concerned about Elijah than he wanted to show. Whitmore called the room to order. "This is a formal evidentiary hearing," he said, "concerning the guardianship of Lily Hayes, infant daughter of the late Thomas Hayes of Calhoun County, Missouri. Both parties will have opportunity to present documentation and testimony. I will make a determination at the conclusion." He looked at Boyd's table. "Mr. Cavett, you filed the petition. You'll go first." Cavett was efficient. He presented Boyd's claim in the clean, factual language of a man who'd done this before the estate left without administration, the departure from Wichita without legal notification, the temporary custody order from Thursday. He put documents on Whitmore's desk with the practiced motion of someone laying cards in a game he expected to win. Then Boyd spoke. The same testimony as Sunday, but quieter, calibrated for a courtroom rather than a congregation. The grief was more controlled here, which somehow made it more convincing. He talked about Thomas, about his niece, about only wanting what was right. Clara watched Whitmore while Boyd spoke. The judge was listening with his hands flat on the desk, and he had the expression of a man who was doing careful arithmetic, not about the law, but about the room, about who was watching, about what this was going to look like when it was over. "Mrs. Hayes," Whitmore said. "Your response." Clara stood. She did not look at Boyd. She looked at Whitmore, because Whitmore was the only person in this room whose opinion had legal consequence, and she had learned a long time ago to direct her energy at the thing that actually mattered. She placed Thomas's will on the desk. "This is my husband's will," she said, "witnessed by 2 people in Wichita on March 3, 1877. It leaves the homestead and all assets to me and to Lily, without provision for Boyd Hayes in any category." She placed the deposition beside it. "This is a sworn deposition from Margaret Ellison of Wichita, one of the 2 witnesses. It was taken Wednesday evening by Marcus Webb, who holds a law license from the state of Kansas and whose credentials are documented on page 2. Whitmore picked up the deposition. Read, Mr. Hayes claims I abandoned the estate. Clara continued. The Missouri Territorial Statute on Estate Administration Section 41, Paragraph 3, states that a surviving spouse retains full administration authority without filing requirement for a period of 12 months following the date of death, provided the spouse
This story
remains
was
in
posted on the
residence
channel
or
The Rusty
documents an
Saddle.
extenuating
Please do not
circumstance for
repost it in
departure.
any form.
She placed the copied statutes on the desk. Thomas died 9 months ago. I am within the 12-month window. And my extenuating circumstance? She paused. Is sitting in Boyd Hayes's file with his own lawyer's handwriting on it. The document he brought to my house 3 weeks after Thomas's funeral, transferring the land title to his own name, which he presented to me as a management arrangement, and which is in fact a full and unconditional transfer. She reached into her inside pocket and put the copy of Boyd's document on the desk beside everything else. The room was very quiet. Cavett leaned toward Boyd and said something in a low voice. Boyd's face had gone through 3 different expressions in the last 30 seconds and had landed on something that was not quite as composed as it had been. Where did you get that document? Cavett said. I copied it. Clara said the night Boyd brought it to my house, before I gave it back to him. I've been carrying the copy since April. She looked at Boyd directly for the first time. I told you I was a schoolteacher. Schoolteachers make copies. One of the men along the wall, a rancher Clara didn't know, made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but lived in the same neighborhood. Whitmore was still reading. He read slowly and carefully, the way a man reads when he's hoping to find something that changes what the words are saying and is not finding it. Your Honor, Crane said, moving forward. Whatever the legal technicalities here, the moral question remains. I'd like to speak to the moral question, Ruth Calloway said from her chair. Whitmore looked up. Ruth stood. She was not a woman given to dramatic gestures, and she didn't make one now. She just stood and looked at Whitmore with the steady authority of a woman who had decided to say something true in public and had made her peace with the cost of it. I've lived in Dustfall for 22 years, she said. I've watched Reverend Crane conduct 3 proceedings like this one in that time. Agnes Barlow in 1873, Della Marsh in 1875, Dorothy Caldwell in 1876. She paused. In each case, a woman who had recently lost her husband found herself in a dispute about property, or children, or both. In each case, Reverend Crane presented himself as acting in the interest of Christian community standards. In each case, the woman lost what she had. Ruth looked at Crane. Agnes Barlow is in a boarding house in Abilene. Della Marsh's children were placed with a family 3 counties away. Dorothy Caldwell. I don't know where Dorothy Caldwell is. Nobody does. She turned back to Whitmore. I am here today because I failed to speak at those hearings, and I have regretted it since, and I am not willing to carry a 4th regret. Her voice did not waver. Whatever you decide, Your Honor, I want it on your record that I said this. Crane's voice came sharp and controlled. Mrs. Calloway, your personal grievances against my ministry are not relevant to this proceeding. I'd like to speak to that, Thomas Greer said. He stood from his chair along the wall with the unhurried movement of a large man who is not in a hurry because he doesn't need to be. I've known Elijah Cross for 12 years, he said. I've known him to be honest in his business fare, in his dealings, and harder on himself than on anyone else. He glanced at Elijah, who was looking at the desk jaw set. His wife was a good woman. When she died, this county lost something, and Elijah Cross nearly lost himself. He looked at Whitmore. What I've seen in the past 2 weeks is a man coming back to the living. That's not a scandal. That's a mercy. Mary Greer, seated beside where her husband had been, reached out and put her hand over Clara's on the table. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Whitmore set down the deposition. He looked at the documents arranged on his desk. The will, the statutes. The copied transfer the deposition with the expression of a man doing the arithmetic and arriving at an answer he'd been trying to avoid and could no longer justify avoiding. He looked at Crane. Crane looked back at him with the particular confidence of a man who had been in this position before and won. But Whitmore had been in the room for Ruth Calloway's testimony, and he had been in the room for Thomas Greer's. And he was looking right now at the copied document in Boyd Hayes's handwriting that nobody had known Clara had, and he was thinking about what it would look like in a circuit court appeal, which there would be if he ruled against her because Elijah Cross had been a federal investigator for 6 years and was not a man who stopped, and he was doing the arithmetic. The petition for temporary custody, Whitmore said, is denied. Boyd's chair scraped. Your Honor. The temporary order signed Thursday is hereby vacated. Whitmore continued speaking over him, on the grounds that it was obtained without proper notice to the respondent in violation of territorial procedure. He looked at Cavett. Counsel, you know better. Cavett had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. Regarding the guardianship petition itself, Whitmore said, he picked up Thomas's will, set it down, picked up the deposition, set it down. The documentation provided by Mrs. Hayes establishes valid testamentary intent by the deceased, witnessed and deposed in accordance with territorial law. The estate administration period has not elapsed. And the document submitted by Mrs. Hayes. He looked at Boyd. Raises questions about the nature of Mr. Hayes' petition that this court is not prepared to dismiss. Boyd was on his feet now. The performance was gone. What was underneath it was exactly what Clara had always known was underneath it, flat, cold, and mean. This is a corrupt proceeding, he said. This woman has been coached by Cross and his— Sit down, Mr. Hayes, Whitmore said. I will not sit down. This woman took my brother's child across state lines and you're going to let her— Mr. Hayes. Whitmore's voice went to a register that suggested he had used it before to stop rooms. Sit down, or I will have you removed and decide this matter without your input entirely. Boyd sat. His face was a controlled rage, and his eyes found Clara's across the room, and what was in them was the thing she'd always known was there. Not grief, not love for his brother, just the ancient fury of a man who expected to win and was not winning. She met his eyes and did not look away. Elijah beside her did not move, did not speak. Just sat with his arms resting on the table and his face showing nothing, and the fact of his presence, solid, deliberate, chosen, was the steadiest thing in the room. The guardianship of Lily Hayes, Whitmore said, remains with her mother Clara Hayes in accordance with the testamentary wishes of Thomas Hayes and the applicable territorial statutes. The petition is denied. He looked at Boyd. If you wish to pursue this matter, you may file with the circuit court. The next circuit session is in September. He gathered the documents and set them in a stack. This hearing is closed. He stood. The room moved. Boyd said something to Cavett in a low, vicious voice. Cavett listened and shook his head once and began gathering his papers with the efficiency of a man who was ready to be somewhere else. Crane stood at the front of the room and said nothing. He was looking at Whitmore with an expression that was not anger. Crane was too controlled for open anger, but the cold, precise recalculation of a man filing something away for later. His eyes moved to Clara, then to Elijah, then to Ruth Calloway. Ruth held his gaze without flinching. After a moment, Crane turned and walked out of the room. Elijah put his hand briefly on Clara's arm. She looked at him. His expression was not triumph. She'd learned enough about him by now to know he didn't do triumph. It wasn't a register he kept. It was something quieter than that. Relief, maybe. The particular relief of a man who had decided where his line was and had not been asked to cross it after all. It's done, he said. For now, she said, because she was still herself, and she didn't stop being clear-eyed just because things had gone right. He almost smiled. For now, he agreed. Hector appeared at Clara's shoulder and looked down at Lily, who had slept through the entire proceeding against all reasonable expectation, and was now awake and looking around the room with the expression of someone who had just arrived at a party and was assessing its quality. Smart child, Hector said to no one in particular. Saved her energy for after. Mary Greer hugged Clara, which Clara had not expected, and which hit her somewhere she hadn't been guarding, because she hadn't expected to need to guard it. She held on for a moment longer than she meant to. You come to dinner Sunday, Mary said firmly. All of you. We'll come to dinner Sunday, Clara said. They came out of the land office into the full white weight of the July afternoon, all of them together. And the street was not empty. People had gathered in the way of a town that knows something has happened and wants to see how it looks on the faces of the people involved. Clara walked out into it with Lily on her hip and her head up, and she did not look to either side, not because she was performing courage, but because she was too tired for performance, and what was left after performance was just the real thing. She heard from somewhere in the loose cluster on the boardwalk a woman's voice say quietly, "Good. Just that. Just good." She didn't see who said it. Boyd came out behind them. He stopped when he saw the street and the people and Clara standing in the middle of it not looking at him. He stood for a moment, and something moved through his face.
This story was posted on the channel, The
performance.
Rusty
All
Saddle.
the grief and
Please do not
righteousness
repost
dropping
it in
away
any
to
form.
reveal what had always been there. And then he pulled it back together and looked at Clara with the flat, certain expression of a man who has decided this isn't over. She turned and looked at him directly. Let him see her face. Let him see that she saw him clearly, not the performance, not the grief, not the righteous grievance, but the actual person underneath all of it, small and mean and frightened of being less than his brother. Go home, Boyd, she said, not angry, not triumphant, just clear. The voice of a woman who has walked across Kansas in July with a baby on her hip and survived and is not afraid of him anymore. He left. He and Cavett rode out of Dustfall together, and Clara watched them go until they turned at the end of the main street and disappeared. And then she turned back to Elijah, who was watching her with an expression she was only now learning to read, careful and open and complicated, in the particular way of a man who has spent 3 years behind a wall and is standing at the place where the wall used to be. What happens to the land? He said. I need to file a formal notice of administration with the Missouri Territorial Court, she said. Hector's man in Wichita can do it by mail. She paused. It'll take a few months to clear completely, and Boyd may file with the circuit court anyway. He might. And if he does, then we deal with it in September. She looked at him. Together. If you're still, Clara. He said her name the way he'd said it from the beginning, steady, careful, meaning what he said. You and Lily have a home as long as you want one. She looked at him for a long moment in the fierce Kansas afternoon, standing in the street in front of the land office, in the town that had tried to take everything from her with her daughter on her hip, and the documents still in her pockets, and the people who had chosen to stand with her moving around them in the easy way of people who have done something real together. I want one, she said. I want to stay. Something in his face changed, opened slightly the way a window opens in a room that's been closed since winter. It wasn't a dramatic thing. It was quiet and certain and entirely real. Good, he said. Hector, who had been standing close enough to hear and far enough away to pretend he hadn't turned to Thomas Greer and said something low, and Thomas made the sound that lived next door to a laugh, and Ruth Calloway pressed Clara's arm briefly as she passed and said, Sunday dinner then, and moved on. They rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon, the wagon throwing a long shadow ahead of them on the Dustfall Road, the heat still pressing, but different now, the quality of late July heat that is still brutal but carries in it underneath it the very faint and distant suggestion of something else coming. August would be worse, but after August came September. After September came the slow exhale of a Kansas autumn. The grass going gold, and the sky going that particular shade of blue that had nothing white in it, and the mornings finally cooling to something a person could breathe. Lily rode in Clara's lap and watched the road and the grass and the vast sky with the solemn total attention of a child who takes the world seriously and expects the world to return the favor. At the property gate, Elijah pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down to unlatch it. And Clara looked at the gate as he opened it, the same gate she'd walked through 11 days ago. Not entirely sure she was going to be standing tomorrow, carrying a baby and a canvas bag, and the remnants of a life that had been taken apart and was going to have to be rebuilt from whatever she had left. She looked at the grave marker at the edge of the property, visible in the long afternoon light. She thought about Margaret Cross, who had had opinions about everything, and would have had Clara in the good room and been deciding they were friends before supper was done. She thought about Thomas, who had been a good man and had loved his daughter in the 4 months he'd known she was coming before the sickness had taken the rest of his time. She thought about what it meant to carry the dead with you, not as weight exactly, but as presence. As the people who shaped the space you moved through, even when they were gone. Elijah came back to the wagon and climbed up and looked at her, looking at the grave marker. "She would have liked you," he said. The same thing he'd said in the kitchen the night Clara had first laughed in this house. "I know," Clara said, and then because it was true, and because she was done with saying less than true things to save space, "I think I would have liked her too." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he clicked to the horses and drove them through the gate and up to the house, and Pete was there waiting to take the horses with the particular energy of a boy who'd been reading the letters on the notice board in town for the first time by himself and wanted someone to know about it. And inside the house, the kitchen was just as they'd left it. The morning's coffee cups still in the wash basin. The deposition still on the table. From when Hector had brought it. The small rocking chair Ruth Calloway had brought from her storeroom, sitting in the corner of the front room where Clara had placed it. Clara set Lily in the rocking chair and crouched in front of her and looked at her daughter's face, brown eyes, and Thomas's jaw, and that absolute seriousness that had nothing to do with either of them and seemed to belong entirely to Lily herself. "We're staying," she told her. Lily looked back at her with the expression of a person who has known this for a while and was wondering when everyone else would catch up. Elijah stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the two of them, the woman and the child in the rocking chair in the late afternoon light, in the house that had been empty of everything except grief and fence maintenance for 3 years, and felt something move through him that had no clean name. Not happiness exactly. Something older and more serious than happiness. The feeling of a life resuming after a long cold pause. The feeling of being needed in a way that required him to be his full self. Not the diminished surviving version, but all of it. The parts that could stand at a gate and say no, and the parts that could sit in a kitchen at midnight and say her name meant everything. And the parts that had kept a grave marker clear of weeds for 3 years, because love did not have an off switch, it just changed shape. Margaret had known that. He understood that she had known it, and that she would have wanted him to know it too, and that the knowing of it was its own kind of permission. He walked into the kitchen and started supper. Clara came in a few minutes later and stood beside him at the counter the way she'd been doing every evening for 11 days. Not in his way, not too close, just present, learning the rhythm of the same space. Two people who had been separate disasters, becoming quietly and without announcement something that worked. They made supper together. Pete ate with them and told them about reading the notice board and got 3 words wrong and argued about 2 of them. And Clara corrected him on all 3 with a patience that was not soft but was entirely without cruelty. Lily sat in her chair and ate whatever Clara put in front of her and watched Pete argue with the expression of a superior scholar. After supper, after Pete went home, after Lily was put down in her small room with the east-facing window, Clara and Elijah sat on the porch in the cooling darkness. The cicadas had started their slow down the shift from the full-throated afternoon scream to the more measured evening rhythm. The first stars were coming out. The heat was still there, but looser, the day's grip releasing by degrees. They sat without talking for a long time, which was a different kind of not talking than they'd had in the beginning. Not the silence of strangers being careful. The silence of people who have been through something together and don't need to fill it. "September," Clara said eventually. September. Elijah agreed. If Boyd files with the circuit court, we'll be ready. I know, she paused. I'm not worried. He looked at her. I mean that, she said. I'm not sitting here preparing for catastrophe. I'm sitting here. She looked out at the dark. That's new. He understood what she meant. The difference between surviving and actually being in the moment you were in. The difference between a person managing the present against the future and a person who was simply genuinely present. Good, he said. She turned and looked at him, and he looked back at her, and what was between them in that moment had been building for 11 days through legal documents and church confrontations and 5 in the morning standoffs at the gate, and a baby grabbing a shirt and a song hummed in the kitchen, and a hand pressed briefly on an arm in the street. Not love in the sudden sense, not the lightning strike version, but the real kind, the slow kind. The kind built out of choosing each other in small ways until the choosing became the shape of things. He didn't say it. She didn't say it. It didn't need to be said yet. There was time. That was the thing she hadn't had for years' time. The unrushed, unfrightened sense of it. The ability to let something be what it was becoming without needing it to be finished. She had it now. Lily slept inside, wanted and safe. The grave marker stood at the edge of the property, not forgotten, not a wound anymore, but a fact, part of the land, part of the story. The way all losses become part of the story, if you survive them long enough to tell it. And on the porch of the house that had been built by a man who was learning to come back to the living, 2 people sat in the Kansas night and breathed the cooling air, and let the quiet be what it was. Not empty, not waiting, but full in the way that only the hardest won things are full. Some families were born. Some were built one hard choice at a time, through heat and courtrooms, and the stubborn refusal to stop. This one had been built out of a woman who walked through summer to reach a gate, and a man who opened it, and what they had made between them out of grief and courage and 11 days, and the particular mercy of a baby who grabbed hold and didn't let go, was theirs, completely and permanently theirs. And nothing in Kansas or Missouri or any courthouse between them would ever change that now.